we're nearly at the end of Northern Agenda Live and we've covered a lot of ground, but before we go we have time for one more eagerly awaited keynote speech. We've heard from the Conservative government's Levelling Up Minister about how he wants to bridge the North-South divide, but what would Labour do if it was in power? To find out more, we have Labour's Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, a former student at Newcastle University, just down the road, who has been MP for Wigan for the last 12 years. So welcome to the stage, Lisa Nandy.
Thank you so much, Rob, and it is genuinely a pleasure to be back in Newcastle today. This is the city where I spent 3 of the happiest years of my life. I came here at the age of 18, having left behind a warm, friendly Lancashire community, and found exactly the same warm, friendly community in Jesmond, where I spent 3 years. And I had the chance to study at one of the best universities in the world. With no offence to the others, I think it is genuinely the best. And it changed my outlook over those 3 years, the people that I met, the things that I learned. Not least that I discovered that Lancashire is actually in the south and not the north. But it was an exciting time to be in Newcastle because we'd had the decay and the division of the 1980s that I grew up in. And after all of that, the Labour government, the incoming Labour government, was helping our northern cities, Newcastle, Manchester, Leeds, to rise like phoenix from the ashes. It's the sort of city, I think, Newcastle, that you can leave but it never leaves you. It's a globally connected city that is also deeply locally rooted. It's a city that is proud of its past but is ambitious about its future. And that is the spirit that I want us to summon for the challenges that lie ahead for the North. Because I think it's fair to say that the last decade has not been kind to us. In too many communities across the north of England, people have watched the very social fabric fall apart. Our high streets are struggling, too many of the pubs, the banks, the post offices, those institutions that the Tory MP Jessie Norman once said shape and define us as we shape and define them have disappeared. And the Prime Minister made headlines a few months ago when he came to the North East to talk about those great British institutions, and in particular singled out Peppa Pig. Now, I am as big a fan of Peppa Pig as anyone, but to get to Peppa Pig World from South Shields, where he was standing, takes 7.5 hours by a combination of metro, bus, and 3 different train services. I mean, anyone who has ever tried travelling on public transport around the north of England will say to the Prime Minister, good luck with that. And if he'd come by public transport, he would know that that is the reality that many people have lived for the last decade. That the buses and the trains that connect us to opportunities, to jobs, to friends, to family have been allowed to disintegrate. And that too many of our young people leave their hometowns to go to university, but when they look back, they find there's too little to return to. So we are going to change this as the next Labour government with the best asset that we have, the people. Because if I've learned anything in the last 12 years as the Member of Parliament for Wigan, it's that people who have a stake in the outcome work harder, try for longer, are more creative, problem solve relentlessly, and are willing to go further and do more because it matters to them. But too often those people who have skin in the game and a stake in the outcome are the people who have the least say in the future of their own lives, their communities and their country. And for me, they are where the real future lies. Not so much in the big flashy infrastructure projects that politicians are so fond of. I've lost count of the number of times I've seen Tory MPs touring the north of England with hard hats, promising to concrete over our greenbelt in the last few years. The bridges, the airports, the free ports, these are the things that obsess them. What obsesses me is our people, our assets and our potential. Because for all the political obsession with shiny new things, these projects where all the money goes too often have nothing to do with people's actual lives. In Westminster and Whitehall, the obsession is with trains, but they forget about buses. Now, I've long supported high speed too, because I believe that on balance, the benefits it brings to the north outweigh the very real problems. But if we'd had the power and resources that we need in the north of England, we would not have wasted any time in connecting up our great northern towns and cities and investing in our buses, which is where most people are. And it wasn't noticed very much, but when ministers axed the integrated rail plan, they didn't just take the funding that had been promised 60 times but never delivered. They took the power from the north of England to deliver what was left of Northern Powerhouse Rail 2. It is so deeply frustrating that for all the talk about money and power, the real story of the last few years has been about clawing powers back to the centre. And it's become easy, I think, in Westminster circles to mock levelling up. The joke goes in Westminster that if you ask any two government ministers what levelling up means, you'll get 3 different answers. And in many ways that's true. Boris Johnson says it's about hope and opportunity. Jacob Rees-Mogg says it's about paying your own way. Michael Gove says it's King's Cross-style regeneration of town and city centres, inspired by the Roman Empire and Renaissance Florence. But I want us to be clear about what actually is the problem that we're trying to solve. Because for decades, the communities that once powered our country have told to be grateful for just crumbs from the table. Far too many places have been losers in our economic settlement. Many of them the industrial and the coastal towns here in the northeast and in every region of the UK where good jobs have gone and not been replaced. It's left far too many young people who have to get out to get on and move far away from their homes and loved ones just to find decent opportunities. And you know, I was one of those young people who grew up in Lancashire, who left to make my home here in Newcastle and then later in London. But that was my choice. I want all young people to have the choice to stay and to contribute or to move, to look for new opportunities if that's what they so choose. Because for many of those young people it's not a choice. They simply have to go if they want to build a future. And the spending power that leaves with them has cost us our high streets and our pubs and our banks and our post offices and our bus networks. In short, the very social fabric that holds a community together. It's left older people growing old hundreds of miles away from children and grandchildren. And I see it all the time in my own town, is that people feel the aftershocks of that in every part of their life. Prosperity is declining, the community is eroded, and there's a growing sense of insecurity about the future. Across Britain, we're all proud of the places that we call home. I often liken it to how you talk about your family. I can tell you that, you know, my dad's driving me up the wall. I can tell you that my sister's driving me crazy, but don't you tell me the same thing or you'll get very short thrift. And for so many people, I think that's become the sentiment about our own towns, is that we love them, we're proud of them, but that love and pride is tinged with sadness and sometimes even despair. And that has got to change. This feeling is palpable on high streets, in workplaces, and in local pubs of the places that once powered this country. That contribution that we once made to the future of this country through the mines, the mills, the factories, the steelworks, it's been lost in too many places, and it stings. Now, you know this here in the northeast better than anyone, where Northern Rock, an institution that was built by the people of the northeast for the people of the northeast, was wrecked by a decision to demutualise, which left it overexposed in the crash that followed. And the Tory government that came in 2010 stood by and allowed it to collapse. This was an institution that had partnered this region through tough times and good for 150 years. It had weathered 4 major recessions and it had emerged stronger each time. It was an institution that I don't need to tell you had provided hope to striking miners and their families when it suspended mortgage payments in the 1980s, and it underpinned the civic life of the region through its amazing community foundation. Northern Rock, to me, is one of those most precious of institutions. It's part of our civic inheritance. It's a trusted financial institution that supported a region which, through the mines and the shipyards, was in turn central to the fortunes of the entire country. Now, the lesson of Northern Rock and its long success is that institutions that are rooted in communities where people have a stake in their success and they have a stake in ours can do incredible things. But there are lessons too from its demise. Because For too long, I think, political parties of all colours have failed to acknowledge that the reality for too many people has been one of loss. So while I say to you that levelling up has become a bit of a joke in the corridors of Westminster, and while it may well just have been a slogan, I was nevertheless, in 2019, profoundly relieved to hear it. Because those words spoke to something important that I and many others feel had been ignored and gone unacknowledged for far too long. And I think perhaps the most powerful word in politics is sorry. So I want to say that I am sorry, because the political system has not served our northern towns well. We should have heard it before and we should have understood it before. But I'll say this as well, we've heard you now, and we will make it our mission to bring Labour home, to deliver a plan for Britain that matches the ambition of the people in it. All the people in all the places, not just some of the people in some of the places. So no more broken promises, no more empty slogans. We will change the settlement of this country back in favour of the people who built it. And I can say this to you as well, we won't just play to marginal constituencies and ignore the places that need help now. Levelling Up may well hold the keys to the next general election, but it also holds the keys to the future of this country, one where every community in every part of the UK will have the respect and investment we deserve, and that is what matters to us. We'll reject the system that we've been handed by the government, where ministers and civil servants still dole out small pots of money from Whitehall and ask communities to compete for it. It's like some kind of version of the Hunger Games. It's desperately unambitious that some of us will win and therefore others must lose. But more than that, it just doesn't work. Because levelling up isn't about driving people down. Wigan doesn't thrive because Barnsley's doing badly. We rise up together. And I don't know when the last time was that the Prime Minister came to the North and really, really listened to what it is that we've been trying to tell him for so long. But we do things differently in the north of England. Because we see the assets and the potential in our places where Whitehall often sees problems. And 5 years ago I was serving as the Shadow Energy Secretary, working closely with politicians and businesses in the northeast of Scotland, battered by the loss of jobs in the North Sea. 65,000 jobs have been lost in 1 year alone. As someone who represents a former mining town, I know what that means for people, for their families and for their entire community. But they had ambition, ambitious plans to diversify into wind energy, which would retain the world-class engineering skills that were known across the world. But when I said to them, why are you always here then? If these are the amazing plans that are being built in Aberdeenshire, why aren't you there? But it turned out that they had to seek permission from a junior minister who had dozens of more pressing things to do on his to-do list for just the small powers and funding that would get them off the ground to do the things that they knew needed to be done. And that is why, despite wanting and wishing the government to succeed in their levelling up white paper, why I was so scathing about it in the House of Commons, because nothing in the white paper changes this settlement at all. Britain remains one of the most centralised countries of all advanced democracies, held back by the grip a small group of ministers have over decision-making across the whole of the United Kingdom. We've got a Chancellor who's sitting in Whitehall drawing lines on a map, choosing which of us have earned the right to have some say over the decisions that affect our lives, our families, our communities, and those who don't. That can't be right. That can't be the way forward. So let's flip it round. Decisions should be made as close to people as possible, and the next Labour government will work with our leaders across the UK to make this a reality. Not every place is the same. We don't all want to be King's Cross, but give us King's Cross style investment and real power, and you will see what we can do. Now, there was a lot of focus about money in the white paper. I said it was the equivalent of giving us a fiver and nicking a tenner. But it turns out it's actually worse than that, because for every £13 they've taken off us in the north, they've given just £1 back. It is pretty insulting to be given a partial refund and told to be grateful. to see more money handed over to fraudsters by the Treasury than was allocated to the whole of the north of England. To see Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, told by a Tory MP when he raised concerns about this, "Don't bite the hand that feeds you." But behind the lack of money, behind that comment, that astonishingly arrogant comment, is a bigger problem. A Treasury that fundamentally sees London and the South East as the engine of growth, that writes off the contribution of other regions. That is what managed decline looks like. But we see it differently, that the lack of investment and power in our regions and nations holds the whole country back. And we see this differently too. Just as trickle-down economics, taking a small amount from those who have most and handing it to those who have least, didn't float all boats, neither has trickle-out economics. Investing in cities in the hope that the ripples will create waves that carry our towns and villages forward, it has demonstrably not delivered for too many places. So the centre of our mission, the absolute core of what levelling up means to us, is to bring good jobs back to every community. This is it, the defining mission. And we've begun the process of laying out our plans on how we'll do this, ensuring jobs and opportunities are spread more fairly across the country. So we're promising 28 billion a year, every year, in the next Parliament to rebuild our coastal and industrial towns so young people don't have to move hundreds of miles just to find good work or prospects. That means fairer investment and better decision-making closer to people, to create the transport and the digital connectivity that connects people to jobs and opportunities and friends and family, but also allows businesses to roam further afield and invest in places they haven't before. And we want to make, buy and sell more in Britain. So we'll fund 100,000 new start-up businesses across the country under the next Labour government. Now, I'll say this to you, Rachel Reeves very famously keeps a tight hand on the purse strings. So when she says this is a priority, you can be sure she absolutely means it. We'll bring money back onto our high streets by repairing the fabric of the local economy, not just by giving high streets a lick of paint that the Tories promised, but by putting money back into people's pockets through good jobs and wages and the places we call home. Because I think a government that's serious about repairing our high streets would start with its people. Action now to deal with the rising inflation that is a quiet crisis unfolding across this country for families and businesses. And it just, I'd say to Michael Gove, it's a nonsense to talk about a Medici-style renaissance when most people are simply struggling to stay afloat. Our high streets are struggling because the local economy is struggling. People don't have money to spend in the shops, in the businesses and on the high streets, and they're about to get a tax hike as well. That's why when we say a windfall tax on the oil and gas producers will change people's lives, it's not just because it takes away the stress and anxiety that is currently facing every family in this country. It's because it puts money back into people's pockets, and every pound that goes into the pocket of someone earning the living wage goes back out into local shops and businesses and rebuilds the foundations of our local economy. So we wouldn't stop there. We would freeze and reform business rates to tilt the balance of power back to our bricks and mortar businesses who currently have to compete on an uneven playing field against the online giants. And when we move jobs, when we create jobs, we know it's not just good enough to move a handful of civil service jobs to Darlington or Leeds. We have to invest in our young people to ensure that those jobs belong to them, so they have choices and chances and don't have to get out to get on. Now, there are things that government can do, and we will. The North was hit hard by COVID, and decisions about lockdown that meant we were in lockdown longer and hit harder than other parts of the country, and our children have lost a lot of learning. So Bridget Phillipson announced a COVID recovery plan to help us turn that around, real investment in our young people to make sure that a generation isn't written off or left behind. But there are other things that we know are better done by others. So we'll work with the North to ensure local leaders have the powers to match skills investment to the realities of the local economy. Because while the government takes its inspiration from Jericho and the Roman Empire and Renaissance Italy, we take ours from much closer to home, in Grimsby, Preston and Newcastle. In Preston, many of you will know that the local council has developed its assets to build wealth in the community and keep it local. In Grimsby, the Regional Development Agency, which did such amazing work until it was abolished after 2010, had the foresight to invest in wind energy, levering in private investment to create life-changing jobs and apprenticeships that mean that young people from Grimsby are now powering the world from the Grimsby docks. Within living memory, there are so many places across Britain that did this too, and why shouldn't young people in those places have the chance to power us through the next century, like their parents and grandparents powered us through the last? And here in Newcastle, I was thinking on the way here, Nick Forbes has done so much to steer his city through the most difficult, divisive decade of cuts to local government's budgets and money stripped out of people's pockets, and upholding Newcastle's pride sometimes through sheer political will. They had a living wage here in Newcastle long before the rest of the United Kingdom. More council homes have been built here in a decade than in the last 40 years. Thousands of jobs have been created in the offshore cluster. It contributes £139 million to the regional economy. And across the north, that spirit that Nick exemplifies, I find in countless businesses and community groups and leaders and colleges who have been rebuilding Britain from the ground up. The last decade has seen enormous social and political upheaval and a turbocharging of the decline over the last 40 years. But what remains in the end is each other and ordinary people doing the most extraordinary things. Imagine what they could achieve with a government that backed them. We could build good jobs back in every community. There's a global race to create these jobs, and we could bring them here so that young people power us through the next generation like their parents and grandparents powered us through the last. This is the Britain we can be. So my message to those who saw it long before their politicians did is this. My message to those who knew that the future could be better than the one that is currently on offer and tried to give voice to it for so long but were ignored, is that we've heard you and we will give you more than just slogans. We will give you a government with an ambition for Britain that matches the ambition of the people in them. It was George Orwell, who is forever associated with my town for good or bad through the road to Wigan Pier, who once said, "This is the country that lies beneath the surface, and it will be heard." Thank you.
Great.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa, for that great speech. So that's the end of our conference today. I hope you found it interesting and enlightening. We've heard some great keynote speeches and we've heard fascinating debates on health, education, clean growth, businesses and jobs. I think the main message that I've heard from pretty much everyone is that local leadership, the North doing it for itself, is what needs to happen. It needs to go further and faster than it is at the moment, and that's, I hope, something that will translate into reality in the months and years ahead. So you can look out for full reports on this conference in the Northern Agenda newsletter, and we'll be doing a special edition of the podcast in the next few days. And thank you everyone for attending today.